division of labor. As latter as 2003, describing this for the social sciences, offered a schema that, in the epistemic gaze of the West, fixes theory building and methodological advancements as activities within the specialization of the North, which is classified as the core, while the South, or the periphery, is conceptually codified as a space for empirical testing of these received principles and methods. In economic parlance, the core and periphery are inextricably assigned to the supply and demand sides of knowledge production, respectively. Hence, the best scenario this ordering of association produces is experts in the core and droves of captive minds, as Alata's 1972 describes this, in peripheral economies. While there are multiple mechanisms in place to perpetuate the said order, research funding and the geographies of the same is a key channel. There are those who also make the case that the assessment criteria set, for instance, by African universities represents yet another route through which the depicted North-South dichotomy is perpetuated. To begin with, the preponderance of largest spenders on research in economies are state-run institutions such as National Science Foundation in the US, Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, and philanthropies or foundations like the Wellcome Trust UK, Ford Foundation, and others. These are not only the systemically important funders generally, but they are also the sources of the larger chunk of research monies flowing into Africa. Hence, such financial asymmetry incapacitates any hope of jointly defining research agenda. There are definitely African-based funding structures, such as the African Development Fund of the AFDB, the T.Y. Danjuma Foundation, and a few others. But these are relatively fringe players in terms of the size, scope, and coverage of their funding. Hence, the best shot of scholars working in Africa is to look to the big funders for support. Therefore, as geographical distance is inversely associated with trade flows among trading partners, epistemic distance is equally an inverse function of research fund flows. The latter, put in other words, meaning the harder scholars in the periphery or in Africa strive to close the epistemic gap relative to the West, the higher the likelihood of accessing the requisite funds to do research. This is another corridor for the instantiation of the expertise in mimicry that I had somewhat alluded to previously in this lecture. The pursuit of means of survival predisposes scholars studying economic phenomena or themes in Africa to either realignment of their research foci to the dictates of external funders or outright embrace of the stipulated themes of interest to these funders. Low remuneration in the academy in most African countries implies that scholars make ends meet by scrambling for whatever non-salary pecuniary benefit might exist. Irrespective of this harsh material environment, African scholars, not excluding those in economics departments, still manage to produce research output that is more often than not comparable to those emanating from much richer regions of the world. Despite this apparent success, it appears to produce what I will refer to now and continue to refer to in this lecture as presence absence. By presence absence here, I hope to convey the idea of the coincidence of the existence and not of the existence of a thing, concept, process, mechanism, outcome, and so on. In the instance of empirical economics in Africa, which is the focus here, I mean the coextensive feelings of accomplishment and acclaim, existence that scholars in Africa are disposed to have owing to the occasional recovery of disciplinary success markers, like getting the next paper published in a good or top journal, winning prestigious grants, being invited to guest edit special issues of journals. Not most times, not membership of the editorial boards of those journals, anyway, and then higher age and high 10 indices. And the grand narratives of the discipline, which, for instance, reduces Africa to a binary treatment in empirical work. While it is less conceptually arduous to think of these regimes in binary times, meaning existence versus non-existence, I draw on Yoruba socio-philosophical thought, as which recognizes complexity as depicted by ideas such as tibitire, ladale aye, not tibi atire. Tibitire, meaning that there is a harmony of opposites, and is possible in the Yoruba social imagination. In this Yoruba thought system, reality can be construed as a union of opposites, like I've said. To add to the previous points along this line, the now standard ranking of academics and academic institutions, which sometimes looks like a league table of football teams, creates for African universities incentives for counterproductive competition rather than the kind of energizing cooperation needed to engender all-round progress on the continent. I ask myself sometimes, why, for instance, should we transit to jubilation mode when ranking metrics improve despite deteriorating conditions in our societies? If our scholarship's relevance in context is validated by tangible improvements in the socio-economic welfare of our countries in Africa, should we bother at all whether we and our institutions are ranked? I make a final illustration of the dilemma of agenda setting by drawing on a recent personal experience. In the course of reading and writing this lecture, I was interrupted by an email from a foreign journal. Trying not to use the term international here for obvious reasons, because if I say international, it means that I agree that our journals are local. Notifying me of the status of a manuscript my co-author and I had submitted earlier in the year. It was a rejection, which is not new to most of us academics here. I reproduced the email here not to celebrate the rejection, though I think it is not out of place to do so, but in order to show that research agenda setting is usually by audiences that may not be interested in what African-based scholars reckon to be weighty issues. Mr. Dave, permit me to read the email verbatim. You very polite there, Dr. Adeniyi. Your manuscript titled So has been unsubmitted to this journal. I've redacted the name. It seems to be to members of the editorial board that the paper is too focused on national problems and not on some broader comparisons. Also, the conclusions and recommendations are for a national economic policy of Nigeria. There is no discussion of appropriate literature and international debates. Therefore, it seems that some national journal is more appropriate as an outlet for your manuscript.
Wow,
From the
what is rejection?
response of, and this was on 17th February 2023, from the response of the journal editors, at least two inclinations are evident. First, they and possibly the readership they cater to have interests that have very little or no bearing on Nigeria. Second, although they really do not have Nigeria in focus specifically, there is a sense in which they may have reconsidered this stance, especially if the paper discussed appropriate literature and international debates. In other words, the base category is the international literature, against which the adequacy of all else must be judged. And then, interestingly, to my surprise, all the previous studies on the subject by Nigerian authors, and I counted that we cited 22, all the previous studies on the subject by Nigerian authors, which we took pains to search and cite, do not qualify as appropriate literature. Something must be out of sync somewhere. It must be that we are the ones that think literature on Nigeria exists, while those who set the bar at the other end believe it does not. This is a clear demonstration of the kind of presence absence that I mentioned earlier. Thus, while African scholarship may have the semblance of desirable object of research, in substance, it is not taken seriously enough as a subject of research by those who exercise power over how it is studied. This
Kicking the
then creates a
ladder.
knowledge ecosystem on the continent that
You're
navigates
kicking down the
mainly via
ladder.
the compass of Western scholarship. Sadly, in this respect, it is not uncommon to hear African academics use the taxonomy local to describe journals published on the continent. This subtle embrace of condescension works actively against the collective realization of the need to make Africa-based journals better. After all, they will never be good enough to be international. Why waste time and other resources? It is noteworthy, though, that these constraints on the behavior of African academics are also typically informed and continuously shaped by institutional frameworks and practices. Mills and Bradford 2002 explored the tensions and contradictions in scholarly publishing in Nigerian academic institutions. in their study. And one of the submissions they make is that Nigerian journals are ignored, rendered invisible, classified as poor quality, or condemned as
As
predatory.
predatory.
This is quite relatable as the University of Ibadan, that I know a little bit more about, has in its vision statement the idea to be a world-class institution for academic excellence geared towards meeting societal needs. In other words, the perspective is that of a localized academic institution that is global in thinking while ensuring that the end goal is relevant to society, Nigeria and Africa more widely. Thus, the fact that the taxonomy of international and local is operational in its assessment structure is a key contradiction of its own statement of vision. In some other universities in Nigeria, growing numbers of open access journals are being launched, whereas the same institutions expect their academic staff to publish in international journals. This is potentially counterproductive since African based scholars and publishers will barely get by within the highly metricized global research economy. That said, I return to the main point, which is that there is also no clear African economics, empirically speaking. To make this point more provocatively, I may even push the limits further by suggesting that there are no African economies, although it is undeniable that there are economies in Africa. Regardless of this assertion, it goes without saying that the readership
Your guy
audiences
is
that
speaking
these
too
foreign
much.
journals serve determine to a large extent what qualifies as worthwhile knowledge. Hence, the imperative to resuscitate moribund and birth as well as nurture new journals on the continent within universities, research institutes, and commercial publishers, where the audiences will be African and the missing resonance with continent specific lived realities can possibly be remedied. Scientific outlets, especially journals, are sites central to disciplinary communication among academics the world over. These journals are an important element in the publication ecosystem, and they enable the interaction among key actors such as editorial boards, peer reviewers, and authors. On the basis of the paucity of funding for African outlets, a phenomenon that worsened significantly since the mid 1980s embrace of neoliberal structural reforms, there has been a huge challenge with respect to representation. By this, I mean that the political economy of knowledge production in and on economics in Africa is one which displays an imbalance in power relations and, more often than not, obscuring the African contribution. Academic economists, particularly those seated in universities, have minimal options in disseminating their research in journals based in their universities or others around the continent, and therefore look towards and aspire to publish in foreign journals. This, in the extreme, results in the fetishization of the foreign, and by the same token, an often implicit denigration of the domestic. One unintended consequence of this lopsidedness is that the capacities required to invest in maintaining and possibly improving the quality of domestic journals are hardly ever built, owing to the entrenched idea that the returns to such efforts are low. Concentrating primarily on representation, Chiwa 2021 frames this empirical exercise as a pertinent question, namely, does economics have an African problem? Among other things, he probed authorship patterns in top 10 economic journals that have some indication that Africa is the geographic focus of interest in order to tease out the share of authors from and within Africa who have been listed in articles accepted in the journal over a 10-year period. And that table uh, shows a list of journals. According to Chewa, on average, only 25% of journal articles published on Africa had at least one African based author over the 10-year period. What is also striking beyond this apt depiction by Chilwa is that the low representation of African authors is also manifest in the two main journals, or the only two journals that contain Africa in their titles. So the fact that they have Africa in the title didn't make them different from the others. Although they both have stated mandates to publish articles only on Africa, over the decade in question, the larger chunk of that intellectual output accrued to non-Africans. While Chilwa rightly paints this picture and expresses the hope that his paper sparks a long due conversation about the politics and implications of patterns of knowledge production and economics in Africa, an alternative interpretation I elect is one of skepticism about the transformative potential of limiting the terms of contestation only to inclusiveness. My point is that rather than solely viewing representation as exclusion, representation as presence absence should equally not be off the table. In other words, rather than making a case for more inclusion of Africans, I suppose that critically examining what precisely we are to be included in is a necessary prior concern. Hinting briefly on another leading indicator, I look at the editorial board of these 10 journals, according to Chilwa. When I spoke to a colleague about this dismal picture, he shared a very telling image with me. Hope the image will be discussed, and this fixed in my head that idea that the image can speak more than 10,000 words. So these are the editors of the top five journals in our field as of 2020-2021, and clearly there is no space for black or blackness. It is also important to emphasize that the depiction may also suggest that my earlier depiction may suggest that Africa is at least featured in scientific discourses on Africa, no matter how small the proportion. Nonetheless, the bigger picture perspective I seek to beam the spotlight on here is that Africans are not really there. The models, especially, they are sometimes unrealistic assumptions, the data sometimes, and the techniques, almost always, are not endogenously derived. Working from a premise of the possibility of incremental inclusion will imply that so long as more African-based economies are able to get their papers published in foreign journals, then their participation and voice become improved. I argue that this might subtly detract, and distract from what ought to be the core concern and tilt attitude towards some disturbing tendencies. That is to say, it will be problematic in a number of ways, and I will quickly illustrate a couple. First, within the African academy, it may lead to a marked polarization and a sense of superiority complex. By this, I imply that those who are able to conform to the structure, methods, and formats of the gatekeepers in foreign journals will gain entry, while many others might not, thus generating a rather false sense of being better in the former. The potential danger here is that this kind of bifurcation limits or in the extreme erases the possibility of collaborations that have Africa and the lived economic realities of Africans at its center. I liken this in the full paper to what happened in the slavery that took place on the continent, not the trans-Saharan trade, the colonialism. It was an extension of slavery. When the inside slaves who were doing chores for the masters in the house grew into a false consciousness of superiority over those outside. It thus will reproduce the game theoretic and classic prisoner's dilemma, where in this case, African economies will not see the need to cooperate, and by this decision, the continent gets locked into a suboptimal equilibrium, which is continued knowledge dependence. The second point is that the unbridled pursuit of external validation, which may take the form of higher citation counts, higher impact factors through age and high indices, creates cobra effects like incentives for certain unwholesome behaviors, especially unwarranted self-citation and abusive peer review relations. I'm sure academics here would have experienced cases where some journals will not accept your paper until you have added a list of new references that they ask you to add. Okay. That is exercising power over you because you do not have a choice. You want your paper to be published. Such a rat race may be counterproductive where it matters most, essentially in terms of mobilizing to do the daunting work of rethinking economic theory and practice with an ontological frame and imagination that juxtaposes African realities with the epistemologies that are fit for the purposes intended. To sum up, knowing that winning a rat race does not redesignate the winner is still a rat. The consciousness I argue in support of is that which recognizes the near absence of Africa on the empirical side of the economic discipline. Beginning from such a place of awareness is crucial for auditing and defining the endogenous route that may lead to what might be planned into an African economy. This way, the overly exaggerated sense of self accomplishment arising from the illusory feeling of whiteness, which is attendant to obtaining validation from the masters, can be moderated, if not totally tamed. Taming, of course, being an important entry point to the long road to freedom. Mr. Dinsa, let me move now to economics and public policies in Africa, specifically focusing on what I term endogenous knowledge absences and consequences. Mr. Dinsa, the art of policy making is very much dependent on the availability of sound evidence, which comes from well-designed researches. Thus, transitioning from the preceding section's elaboration on the opaqueness of African economic empirics to public policy making in Africa is my preoccupation in this section. Although it naturally should go without saying that the debilitating presence absence previously described as pervading empirical economics of Africa has plagued and continues to plague economic policy making. Here I will attempt to briefly show that this is the case rather than taking that as given. I will move further to equally illustrate with some instances, albeit briefly, the consequences of the absence of contextual inputs and knowledges in the policy making processes in Africa. Tandika Kandawire in 2011 made the profound point that the mental map that policymakers have of the economy and society has huge implications as to how they frame questions and what they consider are realistic aspirations and permissible solutions. In other words, the policies accepted and pushed by policy-making institutions, especially those in Africa, are as good as the input or evidence into the decision making. I rely on two well-known cases related to Africa in attempting to subsequently analyze the nature of empirical evidence, feeding policy on the one hand, and the typically dire backlashes of running uncritically with the same on the other hand. These cases are the Menserian returns to schooling
This one,
and the Africa Dome.
this equation,
Minsa
I
in
have issue with it.
1974,
You
uh,
submit everything you
his
say.
equation showed
When I
that the
go,
average mortgage
the
returns to
behavior is
extra years of
passive aggressive.
schooling,
It's not
especially for the
applicable
US
here.
economy, which in model was important for policymakers who had the assignment of making decisions on education spending,
The lecturer was
prioritizing of
asking my
schooling
friend for
levels, and
hourly wage.
education
Mo ní ṣòwò
financing
sọ fún
programs
pé
such as
in
student loan.
Nigeria there's no
When
the
this
lecturer
seemingly
now what?
innocuous and analytically derived position was relocated from its base to Africa, it took on a completely different form. To summarize, the ministerial results indicates that the returns to additional schooling diminishes as individuals progress to higher levels of education. Thus, tertiary education, for example, yields lower returns to society as
Yeah.
against primary education.
Mm-hmm.
The implicit assumption underpinning this is the fundamental
The
dichotomy
screening
between
method
the private and social dimensions of returns. In other words, while tertiary education yields higher private returns to the
to the
individual,
individual
the
than the
social returns are
society.
much lower. Unlike primary education, which produces higher social returns but lower private returns
That's the
to the
belief
individual. This means that for public policy, society should concentrate financial resources in supporting basic and primary education
than higher
and limit
education.
funding to public higher
Yeah.
education.
That is what our
Unfortunately,
government
many
is doing.
African governments bought into this
That's
logic,
what they are doing now.
and the exponential decay in academic institutions that followed this policy choice remains an ongoing concern for all stakeholders in Africa's higher education system, even today.
And whereas they are funding their
Kandawiri
own
mentions a
universities.
case in which the local government of a country actually went to the extent of closing down the only institution of higher education in their country in compliance with international best practices. The
It's
future of
real.
the kind of self-inflicted sabotage highlighted in the foregoing extract and financial repression in African universities has done more harm than good to the public higher education system. Not surprisingly, such decisions over time was in part due to empirical evidence provided by the main proponents in the mid-80s, such as the World Bank and the bandwagon of reinforcing submissions of researchers who were mostly externally funded and in some cases based on the continent. Mr. Dinsa, I will move quickly to my second illustration. The second illustration which I briefly make, is that of the infamous Africa dummy. In the 1990s, a barrage of empirical attempts were made to understand the suggestion in Barrow 1991 that there appears to be adverse effects on growth from being in sub-Saharan Africa. This led to the so-called mystery of the African dummy. During this era, it was fashionable, if not standard, to
Okay, this should
include
be
a dummy
angel
variable to
cough.
represent Africa in cross-country code
Angel
reports
cough.
that had African countries in the sample. This imposed this imposed dummy variable almost always returned a negatively signed estimate, thus becoming the key explanation as to Africa's growth tragedy as it was then labeled. To reflect the uncertainty surrounding this entire enterprise, the negative sign of the dummy was argued to be contingent on an assessment of somewhat disparate factors, including the list that Kandawire uh, put forward: unfortunate history, levels of state legitimacy, distance of Africa from the equator, number of landlocked countries, and then our ethnic diversity. This overall produced a sense of African exceptionalism. That is, the idea that things work elsewhere, but not in Africa, both in academic and policy circles. In the early 2000s, to cite another instance, Burnside and Dollar in the year 2000, embracing
Bonsai.
this specific premise, presented empirical evidence to show
Aid.
that the foreign aid economic growth relationship is positive and works as such where institutions are good.
Mhm.
Of course, it's almost a no-brainer that institutions in Africa had to be bad to complete the loop in the argument. This undoubtedly
It's like he
absolved
doesn't
the
like it and
aid-disbursing countries of any blames about poor economic performance in the receiving peripheral countries and perpetuates the imbalances in power relations, which stacks the odds against the aid recipient. So the aid receiver, in this case, invariably operates within the matrix of presence absence. Mr. Dinsa, having said all this, am I then on the basis of these identified limitations suggesting that we cease from teaching using foreign textbooks or refrain from publishing in top journals in the field or work our ways up to the ladder to the professoriate or ignore calls for grant funded proposals issued by foreign bodies or avoid consultancy contracts when development agencies and other multilateral organizations come calling? My answer is a resounding no. It will require an uncanny capacity to deny the obvious, to abstract from the deplorable material conditions of African universities and the scholars that pursue their careers within them. As a good friend of mine is always quick to point out, the person who is neck deep in an unending battle for making ends meet or survival will not and cannot mysteriously produce path-breaking research. This coheres with the Yoruba adage that says, "Ebi kì í wọnú, ọ̀rọ̀ mi wọ̀," which I roughly translate here as hunger pangs supersedes all considerations. Academics in Nigeria's public universities, for instance, just recently lived through a most unpleasant episode of 8 months industrial action without pay, which took its toll in terms of untold hardship and other serious threats to their livelihoods. Beyond these more physical injuries, many are yet to recover from the psychic and emotional bashing that the episode represented. I have had cause to speak to a number of colleagues who still feel demeaned and undervalued based on their recollections of the language and treatment meted out by the federal government. Thus, I'm not oblivious of the fact that threats to physical and mental wellness are invariably threats to existence. Nonetheless, the whole point of my attempt in this lecture at trying to recover Africa in economics is to nudge us, Africa-based economists, into reflexivity. It is to possibly jolt us into collectively thinking of prioritizing a practice on the continent that has genuine interest in societal relevance as possibly the overriding and guiding perspective. So, what should we then aspire to? Put differently, what should an African economics look like for it to be recognizable as such? Unfortunately, I have not reflected enough on these pertinent questions and also acknowledge that the answers are not likely to be the easiest to apprehend and neatly assemble. It will take more than individual effort to both imagine and produce what may eventually be negotiated and agreed to as African economics. This process of negotiating its terms of existence must also be one that is iterative in nature, thus leaving room for continuous renegotiation and updating as the discipline itself, Africa, and the world all keep morphing. Nonetheless, I will put some sketchy ideas I have thought about in the course of preparing this lecture on the table in the following section. Admittedly, these are not very well formed thoughts, as I have not had the privilege that could help me with doing this serious ideation. Therefore, I do not think too highly of their potency, feasibility, and transformational potential. I hence will of necessity lean on my limited capacity to imagine, especially by deploying utopian thinking in what I describe subsequently. Mr. Vincent, I move to African economies and the imaginaries of a realizable or unrealizable utopia. I begin with a few remarks on utopianism itself as a powerful means of educating minds. Turner in 1972 says, unless we think in utopian terms, speaking to the South African apartheid setting, about South African society, we will not really come to understand how it works. We will not understand on how many different levels there are alternatives. One key reason to be upbeat about utopian thinking is that it opens the mind to possibilities. It works effectually as a tool for creating mindscapes that are most unlikely to emerge from mere thinking. Beyond this, and as Wiredu submits, one good thing about utopianism is that it may give us a clear idea of things worth struggling for. In the context of the core business of this lecture, I will interpose this to suggest that utopian thinking may at least be necessary, if not also sufficient, to prod academic economists based in Africa to invest in the potentially high returns project of cultivating and nurturing African economics. However, in deploying utopianism as method here, I have elected to be guided by the awareness of the complexity that uncertainty, far above perceived risk, brings to bear on outcomes. Hence, I would rather base my short intervention here on the subject matter on what African economics should not be. The by far more difficult task of unpacking and strictly defining what it should be exceeds the remit of my very little intellectual strength. Such doubting task can only be meaningfully engaged communally through social action by the wider pool of Africa-based and Africanist economists. Of course, this will happen if and only if a consensus is reached somehow on the need to venture for potential gains. Mr. Nisa, let me now turn to what I think it should not be. Number one, African economics should not be a social field that harbors discursive approaches to both theory building and methodology. By this, I suggest that theories and the models they spawn do not solely have to be based on formalism through mathematical representation. This renewed emphasis would track back to the origins of economic thinking as grounded in domains such as moral philosophy, economic anthropology, political economy, and so on. Its prime focus will be on observing, understanding, and explaining economic phenomena as it is encountered and encoded in African lived realities. This paradigm shift, of course, is not a call to utterly redesignate and condemn mathematical modeling as arm's length endeavors. It is rather to intentionally view them as what they truly are, tools and therefore complementary. Since they are tools, they cannot at once be the understanding of the issues. At best, They assist with further illuminating what is already observed and understood intuitively. By this I mean an African centered intuition. We as Africa based economists have a duty to our continent that requires that we engage cautiously with the over mathematicization of our field. In his Nobel Prize lecture in 1974, Nobel laureate Friedrich von Hayek expressed immense reservations about the excessive reliance on formalism in economic analysis. He said, "It seems to me that this failure of economists to guide policy more successfully is closely related to its propensity to imitate the procedures of the physical sciences, an attempt which in our field may lead to outright error." This fetish for quantification is driven by the age-long aspiration of economics as science. However, Hayek raised objection to thinking of economics as a science in order to fuel what he referred to as the pretense of knowledge, which is basically the notion that anyone can be so knowledgeable as to manage society successfully. Many decades after Hayek, we inhabit an economics field that has undeniably become ever so sophisticated in its fanciful propositions and models, although its capacity to deliver on its most important task, which is understanding and explaining economic phenomena in time and space, has been called to question repeatedly. The economics that will cater to the needs of Africa, which I imagine here to be African economics, therefore should not be one that uncritically dismisses unconventional sources of theoretical insight and data generation. This means that literature, both oral and textual, folklore, music, our community elders and sages, and other narrative genres on Africa may have to be carefully engaged with a view to attaining a corpus of discursive economics which is consistent with lived experiences on the continent. Mathematical tools may, of course, be used to support this exercise where necessary. Number two, African economics should not be a monolithic field. By this I imply that it must not be one that opens itself up to perpetual, it must be one that opens itself up to perpetual examination and re-examination. In other words, the dynamic feature of reflexivity should be located at its core. The dominance of the neoclassical school of economic thought has meant that several of the alternative schools have either been confined to the fringes of the discipline or are almost extinct. African economists must be deliberate about allowing the blooming of a thousand ideas. The internal contestation and diversity of perspective that typically drives disciplinary growth should be favored in order to narrow the scope for potentially debilitating groupthink.
Sure. He will carry it. Oh,
Number three, African economics should not be wholly fixated on quantitative methodologies. The preponderance of work done in empirical
why are people
economics
laughing?
particularly relies on
Later on, you
analytical
share.
techniques requiring the
Later on, you
manipulation or
share.
mining of quantitative data.
Ah,
The advent of and advances in information and communication
way of putting
technologies
it.
has also given birth to knowledge
Try over
fields
one now.
such as big data analytics, machine learning, and so on, which big corporations deploy overtly for their business purposes and subtly as a means for behavioral control. So it is apparent that quantitative economics is going nowhere soon. The route that I envisage for this economics that I am proposing that will be better situated to Africans' need is the adoption of qualitative evidence in a symbiotic mixed method framework. Giving a description of these kinds of economics, Posel 2017 says economics has much to gain from interdisciplinary collaboration and mixed methods research. Put together, African economics stands to benefit from this implied variety in the composition of its toolkits. Number four, African economics should not be shy in terms of borrowing from mainstream economics, kindred social sciences, and other fields. To zero in one instance of what is possible, I refer to the excellent paper by Ludwig 94, in which he raises the question how can economics benefit from anthropology? He highlighted the very deep connections between the work of anthropologists, for instance, and what development economics do. The extension of the scope of economic analysis beyond the diktat of markets and associated mechanisms to incorporate reciprocity, conviviality, and other community-founded behavioral manifestations should offer exciting prospects to development economies, in his view. Understanding the complex ways in which economic actions and activities is derivative of sociality is much needed given the specificities of Africa as lived space and ongoing reality for its masses of people. I will hasten to add, though, uh, although with subtle optimism, that the nature and process of the suggested borrowing must necessarily be respectful and transparent. African economics may do itself a world of good if it refrains from the sort of economics imperialism that its mainstream counterpart has been acclaimed to embody in its incursion to other fields. Number five, African economies should not be antagonistic of collaboration. It is vivid from the sheer magnitude of thinking, rethinking, and priority setting work required to evolve an economics that centers and serves the interests of Africa that silo type scholarship will not engender any appreciable progress. To truly observe, know, and apply itself to the intended context, African economics naturally should embrace multi, cross, and interdisciplinarity. This outlook will be effectual against the backdrop of the idea of borrowing that was discussed in my introductory point. Nonetheless, the implied processes cannot be thought of in simplistic terms, especially because there are formidable barriers to achieving success, some of which are include institutional tension. To illustrate one important dimension of such tensions, I take the instance of the University of Ibadan, which I know a little bit more about than others, where the vision is as stated below. In other words, the goal is for this university to have a voice in global research and training, while at once making societal relevance the overarching outcomes. Collaborations of diverse forms, both internally and externally, then become an important driver of the desired changes. However, institutional practices around appointments and promotion within the university are configured in a manner that works at cross purposes, hence creating some tensions. To further penalize collaboration, for instance, the assessment typically requires each author's percentage contribution to their publications to be graded in order to compute the weighted score. While there is obvious scientific rationale for such computation exercise, I, as someone trained in a largely quantitative tradition, have always been bewildered by this practice. For instance, I think to myself, if a contribution of 60% is assigned to a specific author in a paper, what does this really mean? How do we assign weight to different parts of the paper? Is the introduction more important than methodology? Is the literature review more important than the findings? How much does this 60%, what exactly are we attempting to measure? How much does this 60% approximate that? On the flip side also, sole authored papers automatically mean a share of 100%. Here again, I wonder what this means. How do we think or how do we value the ideas of colleagues, conference participants, journal reviewers, and editorial boards that more often than not shape the eventual research output through their comments and suggestions? Do we say that their inputs amount to 0%? What are the ethical dimensions of such subjectivity? And to add to this assemblage of points, how do we even gauge the contributions of the usually many authors we read and cited in our typical published papers? While this assessment system may have somewhat served its purpose in the university, it is still in the remit of our academic calling to reinterrogate our established practices, especially in a rapidly globalizing world and on account of the wicked problems the African continent contends with. Number six, African economies should not be a provincialization of African economic reality. In other words, this call for consciousness is not a migration back in time to nativism. Its intention is not to project African realism about the economy as acutely exceptional. In fact, exceptionalism obscures the latitude for forging fruitful synergies and creates an unhelpful sense of detachment from global affairs, which, despite my recourse to utopianism, I still see as limiting and destructive in the extreme. It also goes without saying that the mobilization imagined here for the recovery of authentic African reality in the economic sphere is not precisely synonymous with outright ethnicization of either African economics or economics in Africa. This also does not suggest being oblivious of the functionality of having the ethno as prefix to economic or other phenomena. In fact, Obono 2022 comprehensively articulated the features and feats of such inquiry, specifically illustrating with its ethno-demography, while also more broadly calling attention to the radically transformative potential of thinking ethno across fields. Number seven, African economics should not be delimited by linguistic barriers. In its voyage into the archives of African experiences and lived economic realities, these economics must reach out across phone lines. In essence, the rich literature on these cross-cutting issues, written in other colonial languages, Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, would have to be included in what may become the canon. This, of course, will open up more spaces for translation efforts and thereby strengthen its ontological foundations. This is likely to give birth to some more unintended but beneficial outcomes. For example, the penchant we have to hastily make claims that no other study has ever been done on a particular subject matter will be moderated because exposure to francophone or lusophone literature, for instance, will ensure that modesty prevails. More importantly, African languages themselves have potency in terms of recovery of economic concepts from poetry, proverbs, images, and other forms of text. Number eight, African economics should not be exclusive. There are clamors for alternative frameworks outside of neoclassical economics, especially arising from the ubiquity of income and wealth inequality on global scale, as well as worsening living conditions in most countries, especially in urban spaces such as cities. Theories of what is inclusive economy or well-being economy or sharing economy are developing and offering explanations for knotty socio-economic issues. Van Niket 2019 underscores this theoretical recalibration as one way of responding to the growing frustrations with the failings of the extant neoliberal capitalist model around the globe. Thus, new frameworks that obviate the flaws of the conventional economic wisdom are high in demand, and African economics has to be positioned to be a formidable supply destination for such innovative thinking. Another important dimension of inclusivity is bringing the ideas and complementary energies of genuine Africanists on board. This can be Europeans, Americans, people from other places who are genuinely interested in the development of Africa. Finally, as Akiwowo explains in his 1983 inaugural titled Variations on the Themes of Association, it is equally feasible to trace the contours of some kind of Asuwada economy, in which caring and sharing for the self and multiple others, including animals and the environment, is pursued with notions such as reciprocity and conviviality at the heart of economic and social relations. Number nine, African economics should not be puffy but self effacing. In terms of how it values its content and influence on African life worlds, deeper understanding of uncertainty in human actions and the unpredictability it forces on the behavior of the economy should readily make humility the baseline. People have said that humility is short in supply among economists generally, owing to what Hayek calls illusions of grandeur, and they have also argued that those practicing in Africa appear to have also hopped on the train. However, there's a lot to learn from the hard sciences, such as physics, chemistry, medicine, which economics has worked assiduously to imitate for so long. For this instance, these real scientists, of course, their prizes are in the will and testament of Nobel. Despite their mind-boggling capacity to control the outcomes of their experiments, still remain circumspect when engaging in their science communication. African economies will thrive if such humility is ingrained as disciplinary culture. Number 10, Mr. Dean. African economies should not be one that infantilizes the state or the public sector. They oftentimes somewhat misleading mantras, such as government has no business in business, private sector is the engine of growth, sometimes referred to as the only one. Government should facilitate by creating an enabling environment, among others, work to actively decimate the capacity of governments to make the critically needed investment in improving their own internal processes and systems. For instance, investing in better procurement systems and rules, and socially responsive budgeting. These governments, being infantile, are therefore not able to mature into the kind of developmental states that scholars like Haju Chang and Tandika Kandawiri have eloquently demonstrated to be required and effective in poorer climes such as Africa. Relatedly, there has to be a serious rethinking of the subsisting emphasis on economic efficiency. As a collective, our reflections should encapsulate issues around both economic resilience and economic justice. The recent COVID-19 episode clearly exposed the magnitude of unpreparedness, even in the most advanced countries. There were images of hospitals in the United States where people were using foil and nylon as PPE in the peak of the pandemic because the health system was strained. Since future pandemics and other natural disasters may be inevitable, there has to be in place modes of caring for nature beyond contemporary efficiency-driven solutions, such as polluter pay principle. The adverse effects of climate change will be more devastating if economic systems with built-in resilience are not, as a matter of urgency, imagined and realized. Mr. Vincent, my concluding remarks. In this lecture, I've made an attempt to draw attention to the consciousness that Africa and lived realities across its varied geographies are not integral to teaching, research, and policy making on the continent. Complementarily, I paint imaginary pictures on the canvas of future time about what these elusive African economics might be recognizable as. Using an eclectic analytical lens, I showed that Africa is unequivocally absent from economic principles and its teaching, while the continent is epitomized by what I have called here presence absence, when the gaze is turned to both the empirical and policy-making domains of the economics profession. This has a multiplicity of implications for training and research in economics domiciled in African institutions, especially universities. Mr. Dinsa, I will rest my case for now with the wisdom in Kadawiri's statement in his 2011 inaugural. All this immediately places a heavy burden on the African university itself. And if Africa will have to run, the university will have to sprint.